Now there was a time when love was up. I couldn't do wrong, but now you need to know. See, I've been a bad man. Yeah, I'm in need. Yeah, I found a brain love for this pain, and I can't wait till you see. I can't wait.
Disclaimer. National Center for Health Statistics Mortality Surveillance System. The National Center for Health Statistics, NCHS, collects and disseminates the nation's official vital statistics. NCHS collects death certificate data from state vital statistics offices for all deaths occurring in the United States. Pneumonia and/or influenza (PNI) deaths and pneumonia, influenza, and/or COVID (PIC) deaths are identified based on ICD-10 multiple cause of death codes. NCHS mortality surveillance system data are presented by the week the death occurred at the national, state, and HHS region levels, based on the state of residence of the decedent. Data on the percentage of deaths due to PNI or PIC are released 1 week after the week of death to allow for collection of enough data to produce a stable percentage. States and HHS regions with less than 20% of the expected total deaths, average number of total deaths reported by week during 2008 to 2012, will be marked as having insufficient data. Not all deaths are reported within a week of death. Therefore, data for earlier weeks are continually revised, and the proportion of deaths due to PNI or PIC may increase or decrease as new and updated death certificate data are received by NCHS. The COVID-19 death counts reported by NCHS and presented here are provisional and will not match counts in other sources, such as media reports or numbers from county health departments. COVID-19 deaths may be classified or defined differently in various reporting and surveillance systems. Death counts reported by NCHS include deaths that have COVID-19 listed as a cause of death and may include laboratory confirmed COVID-19 deaths and clinically confirmed COVID-19 deaths. Provisional death counts reported by NCHS track approximately 1 to 2 weeks behind other published data sources on the number of COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. These reasons may partly account for differences between NCHS reported death counts and death counts reported in other sources. In previous seasons, the NCHS surveillance data were used to calculate the percent of all deaths occurring each week that had pneumonia and/or influenza (PNI) listed as a cause of death. Because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, COVID-19 coded deaths were added to PNI to create the PIC, pneumonia, influenza, and/or COVID classification. PIC includes all deaths with pneumonia, influenza, and or COVID-19 listed on the death certificate. Because many influenza deaths and many COVID-19 deaths have pneumonia included on the death certificate, P&I no longer measures the impact of influenza in the same way that it has in the past. This is because the proportion of pneumonia deaths associated with influenza is now influenced by COVID-19 related pneumonia. The PIC percentage and the number of influenza and number of COVID-19 deaths will be presented in order to help better understand the impact of these viruses on mortality and the relative contribution of each virus to PIC mortality. The PIC percentages are compared to a seasonal baseline of P&I deaths that is calculated using a periodic regression model that incorporates a robust regression procedure applied to data from the previous 5 years. An increase of 1.65 standard deviations above the seasonal baseline of P&I deaths is considered the epidemic threshold. In other words, the point at which the observed proportion of deaths is significantly higher than what would be expected at that time of the year in the absence of substantial influenza and now COVID-related mortality. Baselines and thresholds are calculated at the national and regional level and by age groups. For more information on pneumonia and influenza mortality surveillance, please visit cdc.gov Flu Weekly Overview Mortality. The 10 U.S. Department of Health and Human Services regions include the following jurisdictions. Region 1, Connecticut, Maine, spelled improperly. Maine has an E on it. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Region 2, New Jersey, New York, and New York City. Region 3, Delaware, District of Columbia, Maryland. So this is the country divided into regions. So this is the disclaimer on FluView. And what we're going to do now is go take a closer look at the data. So the years that are available to us, or the seasons that are available, are 2017 through current day. So let's just go get all the data. And let's begin by turning off the COVID. Up on the top here, I have a choice of radio buttons. And one of the radio buttons says pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. And the other one just says pneumonia and influenza, P&I, and leaves out COVID-19. So I like to start with that. In other words, let's start without COVID. And then we'll go look at what it looks like with COVID. So if we look at what the CDC tells us, this is pneumonia and influenza, P&I, not PIC. This is PIC, the one on the right. I don't want that right now. I don't want to conflate the COVID deaths with the P&I deaths. So this is old school P&I that'll go back prior to COVID. And then let's see what happened to P&I during COVID. So let's download that data. So it says as displayed, yes. And we're going to open this in the spreadsheet. So here is the P&I data for the USA since 2017, week 40. That's the first week of the season. They give you a bunch of columns here that we don't really need. Threshold, baseline, percentage. We don't really need those. Then we have number of influenza deaths. Number of influenza deaths, number of pneumonia deaths, total deaths. So that should be total P&I deaths. I'm going to edit that. P&I deaths. Now, right now, they didn't total it up. For some silly reason, they used to offer you the total P&I count. but they don't seem to do that anymore. It looks like they changed things. So let's just change this, make this a formula, and it's simply the number of influenza deaths plus the number of pneumonia deaths. And that's your P&I number. And then we just copy this formula all the way through the spreadsheet, all the way down to the bottom. And that's it. Now, I'm less interested in annual totals right now than I just want to kind of get a sense of the curve and what it looked like. And we can do annual totals if we go to week 40 and then we go to the next week 40. And if I go to the next week 40 and I insert a row, there'll be like a little blank in the chart. And this will allow us to sort of delineate where the seasons begin, where is each new season. So each week 40, and week 40 is the first week of October. So the first week of October is when they begin influenza season. And what I'm doing here on the chart, on the spreadsheet, is adding a row above each one of those week 40s. Now when we chart it, we'll have a little bit of a break in between each one of these seasons, each one of these years. And then we could tally up the total. This percent completes pretty useless. So let's change that to season total P&I deaths. And we don't need numbers in here the whole way. We just need it for short periods of time. And where I see these zeros, I want to get rid of those. All right, so this first season began in 2017, week 40, October 1st, 2017, same day as the Las Vegas shooting, is when this season began. So let's add up the total deaths for that season. We'll come down and put that here in this column. And let me freeze these headers so we can see what we're looking at here as I scroll down. This is where I'm going to put the season total deaths. And that'll be equal to this entire range of numbers. It's going to add all these up. And that's the P&I deaths. So in that year, there were 195,756. That's a big number. I'm going to copy that formula. Stick it here. See if it's too big. No, it's perfect. 175,794. So we got 195, 175. Let's copy it again here. And you see, yep, got all those numbers. 274, 612. That's huge. Now this year may be a leap year. Yeah, we have an extra week. Oops. We have an extra week here, so we're gonna drag that. Whoa, 431,000 people. And then this finally is this current season. All right, so those are our season totals now. What I want to do next is just make a chart. Let's just see what it looks like if we chart all of these P&I deaths. So this is 5 years of data. There we go. So that's what it looks like for 5 years. I can change the bottom down here where it says national. That's wrong. We don't need that. We want it to have the weeks of the season. So I highlight that instead. And that tells the spreadsheet that that's what the labels should be. And these are weekly P&I deaths. And because we started in the 2017 season, right, so back here, this is October 2017. And I can copy that to go to the next week 40, which is here. And that was October 2018. And I'll copy that. And this here, that's October 2019. So that's the last October prior to COVID. So October 2019 is in fact the same time as the Wuhan Games. And then we go to October 2020. And all hell has broken loose by that point. And then we can go to October of 2021, just a few months ago. So these are the P&I deaths. And you can get a sense of what that looks like there. So those are pretty dramatic. And you see it became rather dramatic about week 11 or 12. And week 11 or 12 has other significant meaning. And again, these are P&I deaths in the USA. And it looks like they're peaking up at around 18,000 weekly. All right, so now we can go back and look at the data with COVID. So those are the P&I deaths. And now we want to look at both of them together. So same thing. I just changed the radio button to include it. And now we have a new spreadsheet with all that data. And what I'm going to do here is get rid of those same columns that were somewhat useless before. We're going to freeze the header row so that the titles are there. Get rid of threshold, baseline, and percentage. Don't really need these. All right, so here's influenza deaths, pneumonia deaths, and COVID deaths. And this total PIC, I'm going to move this over here and call this total P&I. COVID deaths are COVID deaths. So that's it. This total deaths, I don't really need that right now. And this percent complete, I don't really need that right now. All right, so when we go back to 2017, week 40, there were no COVID deaths. So this is sort of bad database design. They went back into a database and added this column that says number of COVID deaths to something that started back in 2017. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. But let's work with what we've got. So let's chart this now. But first I have to check the formula. The total P&I needs to equal the influenza plus the pneumonia. And then we want to take that formula and copy that all the way down through the spreadsheet to all the cells. So now we've got our P&I deaths and our COVID deaths side by side going back to week 40 of 2017. Let's chart that and see what that looks like. So we go to add the chart data. And the first thing I'll add is the P&I deaths. So this will be in blue, just like last time. And this should look familiar. So this side, right? So this shape and all that should look familiar right now. That's the same stuff we just looked at. These are P&I deaths. Okay. Now I'm going to add the COVID deaths going back to week 40, 2017. Here come the COVID deaths. Well, there aren't any. I got to keep going. I got to keep going. And here they come. All right. Now these are all deaths with COVID. And the blue are the P&I deaths. You get to see both of them overlaid on top of each other. So the blue are the P&I deaths going back to October of 2017. And then along came COVID. And it looks eerily like the COVID deaths and the influenza deaths kind of matched each other. Kind of peak for peak, which is kind of awkward. And then the other thing that was somewhat notable was that in this period in the middle, we saw 4,000 people a week dying of P&I. And that just kept going up, and that was long before COVID arrived. COVID didn't really start claiming a lot of people in the United States until about week 12, 13, 14. Prior to that, there weren't 250 people dead, but 4,000 something people were dying each week of P&I. And that just didn't disappear the first week that COVID arrived. That didn't happen. In fact, you see that the blue continues. There's P&I deaths throughout 2020, 2021, and 2022. So that's what makes this such a compelling portion of the story, is that it doesn't appear that influenza went away at all. And when we go and look at the comorbidities from the CDC, what we find out is that the number one comorbidity is influenza. And we find that here from the CDC's site, National Center for Health Statistics. We go to comorbidities. So we know that 5% of the people that died COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned on the death certificate. And that for deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 4 additional conditions or causes per death. So 5% of the people, COVID-19 was the only cause. 95% of the people, on average, 4 additional conditions or causes of death. But the number one is P&I, pneumonia. So COVID-19 now 906,000 deaths. Influenza pneumonia is the number one comorbidity with 443,220, almost half of all the COVID deaths have influenza pneumonia logged. I'm John Cullen. Thanks for joining.
Now